Well, first of all, thank you very much to my two previous speakers and that magnificent harp playing. I'm afraid I could have done without all the speakers and just listened to the harp all evening. Nothing personal, by the way, but she really was a marvellous idea, Eamon, to get a harpist along. I'm afraid you just have to listen to me. There's no free handouts or anything like that. Frances Hutcheson. Eamon started off talking about the golden period of Belfast history, and he was looking at the end of the 18th century when it was all just starting to come to fruition. Frank has reminded us of how it came from America, the influence of America there, coming back here into Ireland. But where it all came from was probably Saintfield, County Down. Frances Hutcheson, born there, 1694, was the seminal figure in the development of, you could more or less say, all modern constitutional theory in the world. The Colombians have a little song about Frances Hutcheson. That's Colombia in South America, nowhere else. Okay? They regard him as the father of their constitution as well, because they took their constitution from the United States Constitution. The French Revolution was explicitly based on the ideas of Frances Hutcheson. Frances Hutcheson had been a major influence on Voltaire and on Rousseau, who were themselves, of course, the sort of the most direct influence on revolutionary thought, but they picked up their ideas from Hutcheson. Indeed, in the first half of the 18th century, such major figures as Leibniz in Germany and Kant, probably the greatest philosopher of the last 200 or 300 years, Kant was very strongly influenced by Hutcheson. Frances Hutcheson's works were written in Latin, translated into English, into French, and into German. They spanned the European continent. He was one of the major significant figures of the development of modern thinking in nearly all areas of modern life. The debt we owe to Frances Hutcheson is probably beyond exaggeration, shall we say. And I say that probably partly because he's so forgotten. So often, isn't it, in a prophet in his own land, forgotten. There isn't even a statue of Frances Hutcheson in Saintfield. There isn't a statue of Frances Hutcheson in Belfast. There isn't a statue of Frances Hutcheson in Armagh, where he was a licensed minister. New Light, Presbyterian, and very relevant that we should be talking here, because this church is emblematic and full of symbols of what the New Light Presbyterianism was all about. It was genuinely revolutionary. It was mold-breaking in a way that a lot of people found very difficult to cope with then and still do now. Now, so leap forward a little bit, or maybe a sideline on the modern world. Unfortunately, we live in a world where we don't really grasp ideas like we used to. Ideas have almost become a dirty word, even in academia. There's often a very poor grasp of history, particularly amongst social scientists. And I'm a social scientist, I should know. Very, very poor grasp of history, particularly the history of ideas. But it's ideas that are foundations of all things. It's up there. It's when you get people thinking up there, that's what changes the world. Scientists have new ideas. Francis Bacon called them aphorisms in the 17th century. You just have this idea suddenly, and you go and test it, you apply it, and then the world changes. Faraday invented electricity, or he invented the dynamo for electricity. The world changes. It starts with an idea, and the importance of ideas are fundamental. And this is why, looking at Frances Hutcheson, particularly in this historical context, 1694 to 1746, he was born on August the 8th, and he died on August the 8th. So what a way to spend your birthday. He was, by that stage, a major figure in not just Irish, British, but European thought. As I say, his books were already translated. He was famous in his days for wanting to make ideas and knowledge accessible. So when he had held the chair of moral philosophy in Glasgow University, he no longer lectured in Latin, he lectured in English, so that ordinary people could understand. So you brought ideas open to the ordinary man in the street. You took it out of the sort of dry elite world and you took it out into the bigger world, where it was genuinely intended to change the world, make the world a better place. It wasn't just, for nice academics like Eamon and me to sit around in our common rooms and discuss things. No, out there, you change the world. Dare I mention, it was 100 years later, it was one Karl Marx said, so far philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. And can we change it for the better? And yet the idea that you can change it for the better was fundamental. And that's why, if you've got the time, look at some of the tablets on these walls to the departed before you leave. They're absolutely fantastic because they speak volumes if you know how to interpret them. The conflation of religion, commerce, and science. They weren't separate things. They weren't different things. No, these were all one. Because if you've got good ideas and you go out and market them in the bigger world, you can change the world to make it a better place. Commerce was very important. Also, by having commerce, you met lots of different people. You had to exchange, you had to interchange with other people. You learned to share ideas. You learned more. You also learned to be more civil. And civility was a very important aspect of the 18th century. The assembly rooms where strangers came, and civility was important. Good manners, restraint, self-discipline, so that you could exchange with perfect strangers. You could have proper intercourse, and that way you learned. That way you could do more business. And also, the science. And this is what Enlightenment was all about. The great age of the Enlightenment, say from about 1680 onwards up to about the Napoleonic Wars. The great handmaiden of the Enlightenment was science. And this was a very important feature, again, which combines with religion. From the Reformation onwards, for about the first 200 years, it led to nothing but bloody war, horrendous wars. And none of us were any nicer to the other side than the others. In Germany, in the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, 50% of the population of Germany was killed. Religious war. And both sides showed that they could be just as brutal as the other side. There were no nice guys. And so by the time you get to the late 17th century, people are starting to reflect back and say, gosh, look, this is all pretty ghastly. There must be a better way. And after all, at the end of the day, none of us actually know who's right. God might be a Mohammedan. He might be a Hindu. He might be a Roman Catholic. He might be a Lutheran. How do we know? And so that restraint, which again was part of the civility, part of the exchange, part of meeting other people, part of developing a scientific mindset, that restraint to stand back and say, look, hold on, we don't necessarily know. We've got to listen to other people. And we've got to listen to them. And then we exchange with them. And then maybe we move on. It's not that we've got to have this one or that one, but we move on. It's what in philosophy is known as the dialectical method. You have a thesis, you have an antithesis or an antithesis, and the exchange between the two moves you on to a new thesis, and then that becomes the new, that becomes a synthesis, which then becomes the new thesis, which then develops a new antithesis, and then you develop a new synthesis after that, and so you get progress. And progress was a very important aspect of the Enlightenment, that idea that you could have progress. Now, this at the time was also seen as a major attack on a lot of established religion. Until 1832, and I'm being very specific about that, until 1832, there was no difference between politics, religion, and society. They were all the same thing. The political order was deemed to be God's divine order. God divinely ordained the order, the natural order of seasons, the natural order of hierarchies, the rich man in his castle, the poor man in his state. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. It was a divine order. So you couldn't question it. You couldn't criticize it. You couldn't attack it. It was heresy, it was treason, it was whatever. But once you started to see different orders, and you start to compare them, you start thinking, well, they do that and they do that. Well, they're quite much better off over that way, doing this way. That starts to break down a bit. And also with science, and this is where science was very, very important. The Enlightenment stated very clearly that God wrote two books. He wrote the Bible, and he wrote the book of nature. The book of nature, the natural world, the way nature worked, was God's own creation. And God was a God of laws. If you understood the laws of nature, you would understand better how God worked. And if you understood how God worked in the laws of nature, you could use those laws to make his world even better. And that's what a scientist does. He studies and learns the laws of nature, adapts them to improve in God's world and create a better world for everybody. But what this meant, therefore, was that you could change the order. There wasn't just one single God-given order. No, you could change the order. You could create a new order. Once you could create a new order, you didn't have to accept any of the constraints of the past. And this, for Frances Hutcheson, was very important because it led him on to, he was a moral philosopher, by the way, it led him on to an attack on the concept of rights. Rights to that stage had always been the rights of the church, the rights of the seigneur. Any of you opera lovers, the marriage of Figaro, the droit de seigneur, the right of the seigneur to any young maiden in the village before she was married. Mozart was being very political there, very political indeed. Okay, but because that was a God-given order, you couldn't critique it. But if you were saying, no, look, that no longer naturally applies, then you can start to challenge a lot of so-called rights. The rights of churches to rule, the rights of an aristocracy to rule, the rights of old medieval monopolies like the guilds to rule, and then, and by that rule, to exclude other individuals out from the opportunity to develop their own unique talents and abilities. And this was fundamental to Hutcheson's moral philosophy. He looked at the situation in Ireland and Scotland in particular, because Scotland had an Anglican Episcopalian establishment but was predominantly Presbyterian. So it was a little bit the same as here in Ulster, where the Anglicans monopolised everything to their unique economic, political advantage. But yet a lot of the new creativity, the new ideas, was coming from the dissenters, the Presbyterians, the Quakers, the Methodists, the Baptists, who were some of the foremost in the development of modern trade and commerce and industry, and they were some of the most important scientists of the times. So there was a very strong correlation between dissent and science and the creation of a new world and the idea of a new order in which there would be no hierarchical rights, there would be equality. Everybody would then have the freedom to develop their own innate talents and abilities. And that would lead to the greatest benefit of the greatest number, and it would lead to a far richer and far more prosperous community. Because what he also noticed was that many people, because the rights of the established order precluded them from changing their station in life, were unable to develop their talents. Therefore, they were unable to serve their community. And this was picked up by Frances Hutcheson's perhaps most famous pupil of all, Adam Smith. Adam Smith, the founder of modern economics, the author of The Wealth of Nations, and Adam Smith always said, or referred to, the unforgettable Dr. Hutcheson. Taught in English, taught all these radical new ideas in English so that ordinary people could understand them. And most importantly, taking off the old medieval type restrictions that had been placed upon economic activity so that you freed up trade. And this was the idea of free trade. You removed artificial constraints on people developing their talents and abilities so that they could go out, increase trade, at the same time as increasing trade, they increase civility and the development of modern civilization. You increase tolerance, because if you're going to exchange with other people who are totally different, you've got to learn the tolerance of them. If you're going to exchange with others, you've got to become tolerant. And by the way, toleration doesn't start with, I got rights. It starts the other way around. The other person has a right to be heard. Then, in turn, you have a right to be heard back. It was two-way, but it starts with the other, not yourself, not selfishness. And Hutcheson was very, very important about this, and so was Adam Smith. It's where the Adam Smith Institute have probably never really read Adam Smith, and certainly never read Frances Hutcheson. Both of them decried selfishness and self-interest. They both said, no, that's bad. People who are totally selfish actually end up being very unhappy. Yeah? And it's not good. It creates a nasty society. It creates a lot of violence and discord. No, the moral was enabling individuals, the community enabled individuals to develop their talents so they could give back to their community. The ultimate justification for freeing the individual was you giving back, not being selfish. That was the important thing. And that was a very Christian message that they were very conscious of. And that's why you get this conflation stemming from Hutcheson into Adam Smith, where you start talking about the conjunction of religion, commerce, and science. And if you look at many of these tablets here, say talking about devoting his life to religion, commerce, and science. It was absolutely fundamental, and fundamental to the ideas of our modern economic world, fundamental to the idea of modern constitutional government, the rights of the individual, but the rights always constrained by the concept of virtue. So rights in themselves don't necessarily make you happy. Rights in themselves can often be quite oppressive of other people. If you're an extremely rich person and you've got a lot of power and your right to use your money, well, you can squash other people's rights for freedom of expression very simply and very easily. No, rights must always be countered by the concept of virtue and the pursuit of virtue. Wherein did virtue lie? It lay in the pursuit of truth. Truth was very, very important. In science, as in religion. But one of the things that this conflation of science and religion did is it brought truth back down to a material level, where you could now start to quantify truth. So instead of being up there, it was now down here. I'm trying to remember the words of Alexander Pope, who was a contemporary of Hutcheson's and one of the great Enlightenment figures of this time. Know then thyself, presume not God to span. The proper study of mankind is man. So in other words, by studying man down here properly, you could also go about God's work. Okay? By proper scientific, study of the relationship of men to men, of looking at what we regard as rights and freedoms and liberties, of looking at it rationally. You were also going about God's business. But of course, it was a little bit dodgy for some of the ecclesiastical establishments, particularly where you got an episcopacy, such as the Lutheran Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Anglican Church, because you were actually attacking their right to define good and truth. And he was saying, no, it comes more out of the general discussion, open discussion, properly controlled with proper restraint and showing proper consideration for other people. Therein lay the way forward and progress. And science was the method by which you could test these things. And part of the scientific method was, as Frank has mentioned, the greatest happiness to the greatest number. What is good? Well, that which enables the greatest number of people to be happy. He was fully aware that there were great problems with that as well, but that was the initial test. Is what's now known as ontological philosophy. That's opposed to continental, which is deontological, where they say, no, there's pre-existing good, which just is, irrespective of the number of people it makes happy. But if you were going to try and scientifically understand what made people happy, what was the best for people as a whole, you needed to be able to measure it in some precise way, or semi-precise way, rather than just wafting up into the realms of mystery. Because that mystery had led to 200 years of religious wars and utter misery throughout the whole of Europe. So, okay, let's try and bring it down here into a rational, calculable stage. This becomes the basis, then, for the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the United Irishmen. It was to apply these principles. Equally, these principles become the fundamental basis on which the entire British Constitution is reformed from the late 18th century onwards. It's the fundamental principle on which the Great Reform Act of 1832 was based. And I mentioned 1832 before very specifically, because in 1832, previously, society, the polity, was divinely ordained. He up there had said, this is the order, we the church, direct line to him, you're just ignorant peasants, you do what you're told. Okay? That's it. But in 1832, once you extended the vote, and it wasn't extended a great deal, you only went up from about 2 to about 4 or 5% of the population. But the principle was established of men measuring their own happiness by deciding for themselves what was the best government, deciding for themselves what was the best order that benefited them to the greatest extent. It's a really fundamental shift. It wasn't just a constitutional change. It was a complete change in the way that people conceived the world, that we should be masters of our own destiny. Again, for Hutcheson always, not that you should do this in a selfish way, but you should do this in the good of your community and the community as a whole, which of course then led to the question of how do you define your community? This at the time led to one of his most radical proposals, that when you looked at the situation in Ireland, and you had 3 legally recognised communities, dissenter, Anglican, but in the 18th century, I think Protestantism only meant Anglicans. It didn't mean dissenters or anybody else, and Roman Catholic. So you had 3 clearly defined entities. Well, that wasn't good for Ireland. It wasn't good for anybody. So what he became a very strong advocate of in the 1820s, when he was living in and working in Dublin, the idea that there should be a complete divorce between the public realm and the religious. Religion should become a purely private, personal matter that you did not take outside of your private life. The public realm should be free of any religious interference, hence no episcopacy of whatever denomination, no religious hierarchies. The state should not see itself as tied to any one particular religious tradition, but the state itself should be founded on the principle of the greatest quantifiable, measurable happiness to the greatest number of people, irrespective of their religion. Then let them go away and practice their religion in their own way at home. Okay? This, of course, became one of the most important principles in the founding of the United States, the Constitution, separation of church and state. The French Revolution, founding principle again. Most of the European constitutions, it was a major principle. It's why in France today, you can get married in a church, you get married in a synagogue, you get married in a mosque. It's got no legal standing. Only the marriage ceremony, the civil marriage ceremony in the mayor's office has any legal standing. How you want to bring your children up, your affair. All marital affairs, you cannot bring religion in. If you're getting divorced, you can't make any claims because I'm this religion or that religion. The children, the court will look at the children and say, where's the welfare, the material welfare of the children best going to be served? When I say material, of course, that also includes things like psychological welfare, social stability. Okay? Because you can't prove religion. But what you can do is you can prove in a quantifiable way whether you're improving God's world and whether you're improving the world of your fellow man, who is also God's creature, just like yours. So you're bringing back, again, to that religious principle that underlies modern science, modern progress, modern constitutional government. And Hutcheson, if you've not read of him, or you've not heard of him before, I do beg you, go back and read up on Hutcheson, find out what you can. His messages and his lessons are so relevant today, 300 years on. We, in this patch here, still haven't learnt the lessons. Nearly every other country in the world has learnt the lessons, but we're still lagging behind. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.